Next up, we have Chantal. Chantal is an OT. She's from Centurion. She's changing the world. She's starting an NPO so that she can help children that are struggling for free, which is amazing. She's incredible. She's got lots of info, and I'm going to not take up any of your time.
I feel so tall next to you right now. I never wear heels. I thought this would be a good occasion to wear heels, right? Cool. Good morning. Are you guys awake? I feel like it's super quiet in here. Okay. I want this to be interactive, casual, just conversational. So hey, I'm Chantal, as she mentioned. And I thought just before I dig into all the information, I'll give you guys a little bit of background as to where I come from and why I'm here today. So I'm an OT by day and a super mom and wife by night. Also, I try to convince myself. But I had the absolute privilege of working in the government hospital setting before. I then worked in medico-legal work, where I basically went to trial for people that suffered medical negligence or were in really bad car accidents, needed to claim from the Road Accident Fund. And then I worked at a special needs school for about 6 months before God prompted me to start Brave Development, which is my newest venture now. I chose Brave as the name, not only to remind myself to be brave every single day of my life, working with these children that I get to work with, but also because it takes a lot of bravery for our kids to get up, to show up, and to fight for their future. And along with that, it takes a lot of bravery for us as parents to stand up, to stand firm, and stand strong for our kids. And so I want to honor you guys today. Thank you for coming out and for doing just that. Cool. Now, if you were to take home anything from our time together today, for me it would be, or my wish would be, that you would be reminded to be brave, to stay brave, because boy, do our kids need that from us. And along with that, to never, ever, ever doubt your influence. As adults that work with children, we have the authority to make or break a child's spirit with one word. Just as one word of encouragement can provide a child with a sense of love and hope and self-confidence, so a negative word can break down their spirit, their self-confidence, or make them build up walls. So though we'll be chatting about sensory processing disorder today, my hope is that by having a better understanding of how wonderfully unique each of our children have been made, there would be a sensitivity towards dealing with each child as their own. That we would watch our language. I'm sure you guys have heard the labels: the weird kid, the busy kid, the kid with ants in his pants, the bully, the aggressive kid, the emotional kid. The sad reality is that more often than not, children have been given these labels because of factors that are completely out of their control. And sadly, they then start to pick up these labels and carry them as a part of their identity. So, I lost my space. Identities, which I want to remind us couldn't be further from a lie. In Psalm 139, verse 14, it says, "I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, I know that full well." So would we not only be reminded of that ourselves today, but would we remind our children of that? Would we remind them that they have potential beyond measure given to them by a God that loves them and that values them? Would we stop trying to put our children in boxes and allow them to jump out of those boxes and be who God created them to be, with all of their quirks? Because we all have quirks, right? I know I do. Now, before we go any further, I want you guys to all stand up quickly. If you're injured, maybe don't jump. I don't want any hip injuries or something like that. Okay, I'm going to put this down and shout. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, so I want everybody. So that was it. There we go. So that was a sensory integration technique. So it's an approach that was found by a really smart occupational therapist in America to help us modulate our senses, which will be the topic of discussion for today. I'm just going to get some water. I'm stealing yours, Lauren. You can steal mine. Oh, cool. So, the deep breathing increases the oxygen to our brain, which helps our level of alertness. Okay. The pressing down on our head and giving ourselves a hug is a technique called deep pressure. So that helps calm our nervous system so that we don't feel overstimulated or overwhelmed. The jumping up and down is a technique called fast arrhythmical movements, which actually wakes up our sensory nervous system and also increases our alertness and our ability to focus. So, hope you guys are ready to focus now. All right. I'm going to try and do a 4-year postgrad degree in 20 minutes. So bear with me, but if you have any questions, please ask at the end. You can get my contact details as well. I'm more than willing to meet you guys for a coffee. Now, I'm not sure if all of you know this, but we learn and perceive through our senses, through our sensory system, okay? Which consists out of our vision, our sight, our hearing, our smell, and our touch. And then there's also another factor, which is our movement and our position in space that Lauren was also touching on just now. Now, what happens is we have these little, I always tell them, I'm a visual person and a fancy person, so we have these little minions that are located, they're called receptors, that are located in our sensory organs, which we get your visceral organs, it's in our large joints, it's in our eyes, it's in our ears, it's in our nose, it's in our skin, everywhere. We have these little minions whose prime job is to capture sensory information, right? Then these little minions capture these information and then they run to our brain and take all of the information, literally all of the colors, all of the sounds, all of the tastes, all of the, what did I miss? Smells. They take and they run and take that to our brain, who then now has to decide what's important and what's not, what's relevant, what we have to respond to, and what not. Now, this process of taking it to the brain and the brain figuring out what's important or not is a process called sensory modulation or sensory regulation. Okay, we all have that. That's how you can pay attention to me now and not be distracted by the light or the guys walking behind there. Is everybody with me? Cool. So, in order for us to respond to the most important and relevant information in our surroundings and not get bombarded or overcrowded with all the little details around us, we have a process called sensory modulation or sensory regulation. So this is the nervous system, which consists out of our brain and our spinal cords, ability to regulate, organize, prioritize all the incoming information, and then help us focus on what is more important. So we have the little minions that are located in our sensory organs. They take all of this information to our spinal cord and our brain. In our brain and our spinal cord, we have more little minions that then sort through all of that information to determine what's important and what not. Okay, and that's what makes it easier for us to learn and to perceive. It sounds simple, right? Think again. Because for most of us, this process of sensory modulation or regulation happens naturally or automatically. For a lot of kids, it doesn't. So they get bombarded or overcrowded with a lot of information, which is known as our hypersensitive kids or hyperresponsive kids, or they have really lazy nervous systems, which means that the minions are super slow to take the information to their brain, and they take super long to respond. So that's the hypo or under-responsive kiddies. So they need a lot of sensory input to actually respond to something. When a child struggles with sensory modulation, we say that they have something called sensory processing disorder. Is anybody familiar with the term sensory processing disorder. Okay, cool. There we go. We've got a prime example right in front of us. I want us to just remember that with sensory processing disorder, it can coexist with diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, learning difficulties, but it can also exist by itself. And often these are the kids that are misunderstood or misdiagnosed because there's not a physical diagnosis, yet they have these behavioral traits or issues that they struggle with. So, and that's the prime reason for my talk today, is that we would become aware and sensitive to that and not label these children, but actually learn to work with them as they are. All right. I'm going to use this to give some illustration. Okay, so sensory processing disorder. Is that big enough? Can you guys see? Cool. So sensory processing disorder is split into 3 sections. You have sensory modulation disorder, which is what I was just talking about, when there's a problem with actually sorting through and organizing all the sensory information that we receive. Then you've got sensory-based motor disorder. Okay, which is often diagnoses like apraxia or dyspraxia, which I will chat to you about in just a moment. And then you've got sensory discrimination disorder. Okay, so often our kids that struggle to know where their position in space is, they don't know where their limbs are moving in space, they have a lack of proprioception, and they are often diagnosed with a diagnosis called apraxia or dyspraxia. Okay, so that's an inability to plan their motor movements. So if you think about jumping over this line, you have to visualize it, plan it, and then execute the movement. So for us, it happens naturally. Okay, for a child that has apraxia, they don't know how to visualize, plan, or execute that movement. So if you say to them, jump over the line, they're like, woman, what are you telling me? They literally have no ability how to carry out that action. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on sensory modulation today. I just wanted to touch on these. Sensory discrimination disorder is when they don't have enough minions in their sensory organs. So they can't discriminate between senses. So if you give a child with sensory discrimination disorder a key, you put it in their hand, well, you close their eyes and you put it in their hand and you ask them what that is, they won't be able to tell you what it is. They don't have enough minions or receptors in their organs to send to the central nervous system to know what actually it is. Okay, now sensory modulation we can split into 3 sections as well. Okay, I'm going to do a 4th because I'm just going to do a normal representation here as well. Can everybody see? Are you good? Okay, so we've got hypo. I should have become a doctor. There's hypo or under-responsive children. Then this is just for physical representation. There's normal. I hate the word normal, but these are the kids that form within the norm. Let me put it that way. Okay? Then we've got hyper. Oh my goodness, my spelling, guys. Or over-responsive children. And over here we've got sensory-seeking kids. Okay. Whoa. Okay. Now, I'm going to use the same example as Lauren used with a cup. Mine's probably going to look more like a bowl. So your hypo, under-responsive child's cup looks like this. Okay, normal would look something like this. Hyper would look something like this. Sensory would look something like that. Okay, so I'm just going to explain it to you now. So hypo-responsive kids have the lazy sensory system. So they really need a lot of sensory input to be able to learn and perceive. Okay, so here you can see, if you imagine there's water, they need a lot of water to actually fill up to the top to learn and to perceive. For normal, this is at the normal size. Then you've got hyper, which means that they have a very small threshold. So they can't take a lot of sensory info in before they overflow. So here is often your autistic kids, right? Then you've got your sensory seeking kids. That's supposed to be a broken glass, just in case you were wondering, because my drawing skills are so beautiful. So this is a broken glass. So it's kind of like their glass has a hole in it, and their sensory information just keeps falling out. So they keep needing new sensory information, new sensory information, new sensory information. So often this correlates with your ADHD kiddies as well. These are the kids cannot sit still. Like literally every fiber of their being tells them they need to move. That's the only way they learn. That's the only way they get to perceive what's going on around them. Right. Everybody with me? Cool. So if I can do another illustration, sort of. This is a band. Okay. And this band is sort of like this one, but just the opposite end. Okay. So we've got a band over here. Right. So now what happens with our sensory modulation kids is we all have a band of how much sensory information we can obtain, how much we can absorb and actually respond appropriately to. Okay, so that's the ideal. These kids that struggle with sensory modulation, we can actually work on that bandwidth. Does it make sense? So an OT would do treatment that's called sensory integration technique for the hyposensitive kid to make the bandwidth a little bit smaller, and for the hyper to make it a little bit wider so that they can take in more information. All right. Some of the techniques that Lauren also shared with us this morning is techniques that we can use with our sensory processing kids. So for example, if you have a hypersensitive child I love this. I actually went to a conference last year where they explained it like this. So if you think of hypo or under-responsive children, think of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. So he's like, he talks like this, and he's slow, and so Eeyore. If you think of hyper, think of Piglet. They're like super anxious, super overstimulated. Those are your hyper. So they get super overstimulated, your tactile defensive kids fall under here, your auditory sensitive kids fall under here. Then you have sensory seeking, which is Tigger. Okay, so they're the kids that would jump around and bounce about the whole time. All right. So that's just to give you a little bit of a visual representation of the sensory system. There we go. Let me just get my notes. Now, very important to remember is that we all have sensory processing, right? It's an action that happens within us. For some, it's just a little bit harder than others, right? So you get typical and atypical behavior. And I want us to be we have to remember that, all right? Everybody has a sensory profile, and we all regulate our senses differently. We all have certain processes in place to help us cope with all of the sensory information thrown at us on a daily basis. So think, for example, and let's see, show of hands. You had a really, really, really long day at work. Who would want to go to a dance party clubbing after that? Okay, so we have no sensory seeking people in the room at the moment. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. So we've got it. So she would need, even after having a really rough day, to modulate herself, she would need more sensory input. Does it make sense? So she would go out with loud music and lights and colors and all of those things. Who here would want to go for a massage? Okay, cool. So deep pressure, that's a technique that would modulate your senses. Who here would want to go for a run? Cool. So also that would also fall under deep pressure or proprioceptive input because of the impact that you get the whole time. Okay, so we have natural ways in our lives that we've established to help us modulate our senses. Does it make sense? Can you imagine a child that does not? Right, that's where meltdown comes. And that's what I love what Lauren said as well, is when the meltdown comes, most of the time, it's a cry for help. Most of the time. Sometimes there are behavioral issues, there are other things, but most of the time it's a cry for help. And I just want us to start becoming a little bit more sensitive to that. All right. So we have typical behavior. All these things that we do to modulate our senses, it's typical. But then you get atypical behavior, all right? And that's when these fallouts, their inability to regulate their senses, actually start affecting their function. I saw a kitty that, I wish I could explain it to you guys, but he literally could not sit still for 1 second. Not 1 second. Until I put him on a ball. He was able to bounce, so he's sensory seeking. He was able to bounce. So he was able to modulate his senses the whole time so that he could focus, perceive, and learn. Does it make sense? I had another kitty that had like super low muscle tone, very like lethargic and slow to respond. All we did was jump trampoline for 5 minutes before we started an activity. Boom. She started getting the information in. But in their case, they were atypical because they couldn't concentrate in school. These parents couldn't get their child to sit still and eat breakfast. The parent couldn't get their daughter out of bed, let alone get them to school to learn. Does it make sense? So we have typical and atypical behavior. Just because they don't modulate their senses the same way you do doesn't mean there's something wrong. Okay, we need to be sensitive to that. So having said that, I'm going to chat to you through a few red flags. So our over or hypo responsive children, they need a lot of sensory input to actually respond. They would, no, I lie. That one, over or hypo. They are kids that avoid touching, avoid moving or being moved unexpectedly, maybe rigid and uncoordinated, gets overexcited with too much to look at, covers ears to close out sounds and noises, strongly objects to textures, whether it be orally or through our tactile system, objects certain odors. Okay, does that sound very familiar to ASD, autism? Okay, so we need to be sensitive. Just because a child has sensory processing problems doesn't mean they have autism. All right, we need to be sensitive towards that. Under or hyper-responsive children, which is the big cup that needs a lot of sensory input. They're oblivious to pain, touch, movement, taste, smell, sight. Okay. They are physically slower. They're quiet kids. They're clumsy children. They're often overweight and they have low postural tone. So postural tone is our ability to keep our body upright against gravity, right? So gravity, they'd be the kids that literally walk like this, or that wrap their legs around the chairs, or lies on their arms while they're busy writing. So those are your low postural kids. They can be emotionally aggressive. They lack motivation or inner drive. They're very lethargic, and they have poor fine and gross motor skills. Then we've got my sensory-seeking kids. Guys, they're my favorite. I love a sensory-seeking child, although I'm actually hyper-responsive myself. So I get easily overstimulated. My cup is very small. Love working with sensory-seeking children. They're very loud and boisterous. They chew inedible objects, pens, pencils. I even had a child that started chewing his table at school. They crave fast spinning movements, all right? So they're those kids on the playground that spin the, what do you call that thing, swing. They crave hugs or being squeezed really hard, so they want that tactile input the whole time. They enjoy loud environments, discos, and they enjoy strong odors. All right. Having said this, now that I say strong odors, when we work with children, we really need to be wary of perfume that we wear. We need to be wary, if we work with children, what sensory information we're giving them. Doesn't make sense. So I don't do perfume when I go to work, because if I have a hyper-responsive child, it can distract them. It can be the only thing they focus on. If I wear really bright colors, you'll see I very seldom wear really bright colors because they can get overstimulated very quickly. But then again, on the other end, you need to be sensitive, because if you work with hypo-responsive kids, you need the bright colors, because that's the only way you're going to get them to look at you. So we just need to be sensitive towards each child as an individual. All right, then we've got the sensory discrimination, which is this one over here, which I told you their minions are sleeping. So we need to wake them up a little bit. So they can't feel that when they're being touched. They have really poor body awareness. They're clumsy, so they usually have a lot of cuts and scrapes and bruises because they can't really feel when they're bumping into something. All right, there'll be the kids that walk with a cut for like 3 days, and the mom's like, did you not feel that? And they literally didn't feel it. All right. They also struggle to discriminate between different facial expressions. Okay, so we also see this very often in our ASD kiddies, our autism kiddies. Okay, then the last one that I'm going to chat about today is apraxia or dyspraxia. So that's our ability to plan, to visualize, plan, and execute our motor movements automatically, so without thinking about it. Now, a child that has apraxia or dyspraxia, I told you guys, don't know how to do that. They can't visualize what to do. So we give them instructions and we think they're being defiant when actually they literally don't have the ability to execute what you just told them to do. Okay. But then again, you do get defiant behavior. But you'll see the difference. They get this blank expression on their face. They're like, actually, I don't know, something simple like take off your shoes. They'll look at you because they don't know. Okay, so with apraxia, they can have a problem with visualization, planning, and execution. Sometimes you get motor planning kids. So they can visualize what needs to be done, but they don't have the planning and the execution. They're very klutzy, clumsy type of kids, if that makes sense. So if you tell them take off their shoes, they know they have to take off their shoes, but the planning and the execution of it is often quite cute and funny because they try and do it sort of what they think how to do it. They're very awkward kids. They struggle to follow simple instructions and carry out manual tasks, and they struggle with playing. So they're often very repetitive and monotonous in their playing, because once I've mastered jumping over the line without having to think about it, I'm going to jump over the line because I'm experiencing success. Okay, so those are the kids that you see go to the swing every single time when it's playtime, because that's the only skill that they've mastered. All right, these are all things that we can work on. Right, there's hope. Okay. So what can we do to help? We need to be sensitive to our children's sensory profiles. Always bear in mind that children regulate their senses differently, and in turn, they all learn differently through their senses. Never force a child to engage in a sensory task they're not comfortable with. All right. Child needs comfort, security, and routine to feel safe and secure. All right. So refusal is a clear sign of discomfort. For learning to take place, there needs to be active involvement from the child. The moment we do to a child, there's not going to be carryover of that task or that skill. They need to do it themselves, practice that skill to be able to learn it. Does it make sense? All right. So if I'm going to pick the child up, put him over the whole line the whole time, I'm facilitating, yes, I'm facilitating, but at a point he needs to be able to do it himself to master the skill. All right. Take place when involves the child. On top of that, comfort is essential for learning to place. Okay. So think fight or flight. So for example, your hypersensitive or over-responsive kiddies that get overstimulated by sounds, the moment this cup is overflowing, they go into fight or flight mode. So do you really think a child is able to learn if they're in fight or flight mode, if they've kicked into survival skills? Now we want to force them to focus and sit and complete the task when actually they're in survival mode. It's physically the mode that they're in, and that's why it's so important to remove them from their situation, help them modulate whatever needs modulating, and then bring them back, and then learning can take place. Cool. Even if a child cannot tolerate certain sensory input, continue to include them in the tasks. Okay, adaptation is key. We need to be adaptable. Okay, we can upgrade or downgrade tasks to make it more meaningful for children. So for example, if you have a tactile defensive child and you guys decide to do a shaving cream activity and they don't want to touch the shaving cream, don't, don't force them. Don't force them to touch the shaving cream because you're going to upset them and they're not going to learn anyway. It's going to have no benefit to them. Adapt. Really cool. I chatted to a friend of mine that also works. She actually does cooking classes for kids. She gave me this cute idea of putting the shaving cream in a Ziploc bag and then letting them play. So they don't physically touch the shaving cream, but they're included in the activity. And for them, it's meaningful. So there will be a level of carryover or learning that takes place. All right. Refer, refer, refer. There are systems and people put in place, ready and willing to help and assist parents and kids. Remember at the beginning I spoke about being brave for our kids. Oftentimes we're scared to ask because we feel like it's a sign of incompetence or weakness. Asking takes a level of bravery on our end. It takes a step of valor for our children. So if you're unsure, ask, because there's so many people out there willing and ready to help. I'm going to leave you guys with this quote. And I'm confused as to who said this quote, because if you Google it, it's either a Chinese proverb or Benjamin Franklin said it. So if you figure it out, please tell me, because I use this quote so many times. But it says, tell me and I forget. Teach me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll learn. Cool. Thank you.